The night my sister told me she was pregnant with my husband's child wasn't chaotic or explosive the way people imagine betrayal should be. It was quiet, controlled, and far too precise to be accidental. The restaurant was filled with soft lighting and low conversation, the kind of place where everything is curated to feel effortless, where nothing ever seems out of place. And that made what she said feel even more calculated. I had chosen that place to celebrate my promotion, something I had worked years for, something I built entirely on my own. And I invited the two people I believed were closest to me, not realizing I was walking into something they had already planned. When they arrived together, I noticed the details immediately. The slight delay before sitting down, the way he avoided my eyes, the way she held herself like she was waiting for a moment instead of enjoying one. And when she finally reached across the table, took his hand, and said she was pregnant, I didn't feel shock the way they expected me to. I felt alignment. Because betrayal like that doesn't begin in a single moment. It builds quietly through patterns, small inconsistencies, shifts in behavior that don't make sense until you stop ignoring them. They were watching me carefully, waiting for a reaction, something emotional, something they could use to justify what they had done. But I didn't give them that. I just sat there, looking at both of them, realizing that this wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the confirmation of something that had already been happening long before I was meant to see it. Mia had never wanted a life of her own, not in the way people usually do, where they build something from the ground up and accept whatever comes with it. She wanted mine, specifically mine, not pieces of it, not something similar, but the exact structure I had spent years creating, without understanding what it cost to hold it together. Growing up, she learned very quickly that positioning herself as fragile gave her leverage, that if she leaned into being misunderstood or overlooked, people would adjust around her to compensate. My parents reinforced that pattern without realizing what they were creating, always trying to balance things out in ways that made sense to them, but quietly distorted everything else. If I achieved something, they redirected attention to her. If I moved forward, they made sure she wasn't left behind, even if that meant slowing me down in ways that were subtle enough to ignore but consistent enough to matter. Over time, that didn't make her insecure. It made her entitled. She didn't question why she deserved more. She assumed it. And when she met David, she didn't see him the way I did, as a partner, as someone I trusted, as someone I built something with. She saw access. She saw proximity to a life she believed should have been hers from the beginning. What I didn't understand at the time was that she wasn't acting alone in that shift. David had been changing too. Not openly. Not in ways that were easy to call out. But in small, controlled inconsistencies that didn't match the person I thought I knew. The kind of changes you don't confront immediately because they don't seem big enough on their own. But together, they form something you can't ignore once you finally stop looking away. If you started seeing signs like this between your partner and someone close to you, would you confront them right away? Or stay silent and gather proof first? Comment your strategy? The first real sign wasn't emotional. It wasn't some dramatic moment that forced me to confront the truth. It was structural. Small inconsistencies that didn't align with the version of reality I was being given. Mia started appearing in my city more often, always with reasons that made sense on the surface. Always timed in a way that didn't overlap too obviously with my schedule, but frequent enough to feel intentional once I started paying attention. David didn't become distant in a way that would immediately raise concern. He became slightly misaligned. Responses delayed just enough to feel off. Details that didn't quite match when repeated. A subtle shift in presence that most people would ignore because it wasn't extreme enough to justify suspicion. I didn't confront it. Not because I trusted them, but because I needed clarity before reaction. Emotion would have closed the situation too early. And I wasn't interested in partial truths. So I stepped back and observed. Not as someone inside the relationship, but as someone analyzing a system that wasn't behaving the way it should. Patterns started forming. Timelines overlapping. Small moments connecting into something that was no longer dismissible. And that was when I made the decision that changed everything. I didn't try to stop it. I didn't warn him. I didn't confront her. I let it continue. Because once I understood that this wasn't accidental, that this wasn't confusion or weakness, but coordination, I realized I wasn't dealing with betrayal in the emotional sense anymore. I was dealing with a structure that had already been built behind my back. And structures like that don't collapse because you react to them. They collapse when you understand how they were built in the first place, something they never considered. That I was operating several steps ahead of them long before they made their move. The prenup was the first layer, but it was never the most important one. It was simply the part they would eventually discover. The part designed to give them a false sense of understanding, as if they had finally uncovered the limit of what they could take from me. What they didn't know was that I had structured everything long before marriage was even part of the conversation. Separating ownership, redirecting investments, creating layers of protection that didn't just rely on legal agreements, but on systems they had no visibility into. Every asset I built, every contract I signed, every decision I made financially had one constant variable: control. Not shared, not assumed, but defined in a way that couldn't be challenged once it was executed. David never asked the right questions, because he assumed proximity meant access. And Mia never questioned it because she believed taking him was enough to inherit everything connected to him. That assumption was the foundation of their entire plan. And it was flawed from the beginning. When I looked back at their behavior, the timing of her visits, the shifts in his routine, the quiet coordination that only made sense once you stopped viewing it emotionally, I realized something else that mattered even more. This wasn't just opportunistic betrayal. It was planned around a belief system. The idea that I was predictable, that I would react the way I always had, that I would trust, confront, break, and ultimately lose control of the situation. That was what they counted on. Not just access to my life, but control over how I would respond when they took it from me. And that was the only part of their plan I actually needed to change. Because once they lost control over my reaction, everything else they built started to collapse on its own. Not immediately, not visibly, but in ways that made their next move inevitable, and their final mistake unavoidable. When I agreed to meet them again at the same restaurant, they believed it meant something simple, something predictable: closure, resolution, a controlled ending where they could position themselves as reasonable and move forward without consequences. That assumption was necessary, because without it, they would have approached me differently, more cautiously, less openly. And I needed them exactly where they were: confident, relaxed, convinced they understood the situation better than I did. When they walked in, the difference was immediate, not in what they said, but in how they carried themselves. The absence of tension, the quiet certainty that whatever happened next would benefit them. Mia sat closer to him than she had before, her hand resting lightly against his arm, not just for comfort, but as a signal. Ownership, reinforcement, something visible enough to establish her position without needing to say it out loud. David didn't avoid eye contact this time. He held it, not out of confidence, but out of necessity, like someone who had already justified his choices and no longer needed to hide behind hesitation. They spoke first, outlining what they called a fair outcome: division, settlement, an attempt to frame betrayal as something that could be negotiated into balance. I let them talk, uninterrupted, because every word they said revealed exactly what they believed they had gained. They thought access to him meant access to everything connected to me. That proximity had translated into ownership. That removing me from the equation had automatically transferred value to them. That was the core of their mistake. And the reason I had allowed everything to reach this point without interference. When they finished, when the silence settled just enough for them to expect a response, I didn't react emotionally. I didn't challenge their version of events directly. I shifted the structure of the conversation instead. I asked simple questions about assumptions, about expectations, about what they believed they were entitled to. not to argue, but to make them define it clearly enough that it could be dismantled completely. And once they did, once everything was laid out in a way that couldn't be reinterpreted, I knew exactly where to begin. I didn't rush the moment, because timing mattered more than anything else. And what they believed at that point was exactly what I needed them to believe. That they still had something to negotiate. Something to claim. Something to take from me. I started with the prenup. Not as a surprise, but as a clarification. Something simple enough for them to process without resistance. Explaining that legally, there was nothing to divide. Nothing to transfer. Nothing they could access through him. I watched the shift carefully. The first crack in their certainty. But I didn't stop there. Because that alone wasn't enough to collapse what they thought they had built. Then I moved deeper, outlining the structure behind everything else. The separation of assets, the entities they had never seen. The fact that every part of my financial life existed outside of anything they could reach or influence. David's expression changed first. Confusion, turning into something heavier as he realized how little he had actually understood. While Mia stayed still, trying to hold on to control that was already gone. And finally, I gave them the only statement that mattered. Not emotional. Not reactive. Just precise. You didn't take anything from me, I said calmly. You removed yourselves from access. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was final. The kind of silence that comes when there is nothing left to argue. Nothing left to reinterpret. I stood up without waiting for a response. Because there wasn't one worth hearing. And as I walked away, I understood something with complete clarity. They didn't break my life. They revealed exactly why they were never meant to be part of it. So be real. Would you walk away the moment you found out? Or stay and make sure they face the consequences first? Drop your answer below. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.